Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we have a very interesting video, and that video is all about the ZX Spectrum, which this year in 2022 celebrates its 40th anniversary. The ZX Spectrum is an 8-bit personal home computer which was developed by Sinclair Research, of course, of Clive Sinclair fame, and the Sinclair was released in the United Kingdom on the 23rd of April 1982, and it went on to be Britain's best-selling microcomputer. And there's me kind of paraphrasing Wikipedia there, much to my shame. And so this video is going to be all about creating a promotion based around the ZX Spectrum, which is totally fictional, of course, but it just talks you through the process and shows you the process that I've been through to create this particular design. As always, this isn't always about the perfect way to do something, and there are probably better ways to do this. In fact, multiple ways to do this, and I often find that once I've recorded the video, I find myself thinking, oh, I could have done that in a much better way and in a much more efficient way. But you know, this is part of the design process, and when you're working in a business environment, you don't always have the luxury of time and hours of research and trying things out, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, which is great when you're wanting to learn something like Blender. You can watch many videos online about how to do this and how to do that, which are amazing. I watch those pretty much every day still, always learning something new. But when you try to apply that in a time-sensitive environment, you often find yourself going down perhaps different routes than you've perhaps sort of learnt from particular videos or content creators. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just whatever works for you at that particular time, and you can always find other opportunities later where you can apply what you've learnt in a better way on any particular task that or project you have at hand. So while I've been talking there in the background, you can see that I've kicked off already, and I'll bring you up to speed. So what I did prepare for this video is to do a little bit of research on the ZX Spectrum itself, and with that I downloaded reference images. With that I also downloaded various like game graphics and things like that, trying to get an idea of what I'm going to do. So jumping ahead, what I wanted to start off with was the ZX Spectrum logo name itself. So what I did was, as you saw here, I downloaded an image off the internet, of course, and I loaded that into Blender as a reference image and set that as 50% opacity. And having done that, I created a single vertex and extruded it to create the outlines of each letter. Now, in hindsight, as I said, you don't always think of the best way to do something when you're faced with a challenge that's time sensitive. So what I did there was, I think in hindsight, not something that I would normally do. In fact, this is the first time I've actually used, I think, extruded vertices pretty much for anything. So I think what I would have done, if I could go back to it, is create a simple plane and shape that to the top of the Z, for example, add some loop cuts, extrude further down, and so on and so on. That probably would have been a little bit faster than creating individual vertices and then filling them in, and then creating subdivisions along edges, and then creating the vertices and cuts and so on. But at the time, it just seemed to be, yep, I'll do that, that'll work. And like I say, it's not the best way to do that, but I hope you learn from this as much as I learned from it, and find your own way in terms of, this is what you've got to do, this is where you want to be, how do you do that? So I'll leave that up to you really. If you want to go and do the same thing I've done, that's fine, of course, but if you have a better way to do it, obviously that's even better. Go ahead and do that. So what I've done is I've sped up the video, obviously, because it's very tedious and it took quite a while to extrude all of those vertices and for each of those letters. So what I'm doing here is just placing more loop cuts and making sure that I have quads across each letter. So I'm using the J key on the keyboard there to where I've highlighted two vertices, and press J, and that will join them and create an edge. So here you can see I've created the ZX and I've created the Spectrum as separate objects. And the reason for that is because I may want to manipulate them independently, and I'm not going to do a like-for-like replication of the logo as such. So this is the final polygons for those letters. As you can see, they're all fairly well cut out. It's not the prettiest topology, but it's all quads and it works. And it's fairly straightforward in terms of its, as a model, it's very simple. So it wasn't really much point in overcomplicating it. Like I said, I could have done this in a much better way, a much quicker way. But at the time, I'm trying to keep my work hat on and say, okay, if I was in front of my PC at work or something, how would I go about doing this? And this is the first thing that came to my mind. So this is what I'm showing you. Obviously, your own experience will vary, and you may take a different path, but I hope it kind of inspires you to do something similar. So what I'm doing now is I'm selecting all of the outer edges of each of the letters, and the reason why I want to do that is because I want to extrude these. And I could have easily just selected the faces, of course, and extruded those. But in this instance, I just went for the default edges and selected those. And as you can see, I extruded them up to a certain point. At this point, I wasn't really sure how deep I'd need that extrusion to go. So I left it at that point and decided to, I think I actually filled in the background here, but then I decided not to do that and instead place the origin of the object at the back of those edges that I've just extruded. And by doing that, I can then add a mirror modifier, mirror it on the y-axis, and turn clipping on, so it connects those vertices in the middle. They don't split apart. And by doing that, I've now got I can just work on one half of the text without having to worry about the other half, basically. So it halves your time and your work. What I'm doing now is adding what I called support edges, and again, this is just one way that I did this. There are probably several ways we can do this. In fact, in a previous video, you may remember that we highlighted a set of edges and added the mean bevel weight variable to that. So in the top right, you can see there under the transform box, you've got edges data. So if we can add edges, make them 1 as opposed to 0, and use a bevel modifier to target those edges and make them beveled effectively. But what I did in this instance is add supporting loops around edges and corners, and it's very easy to miss things like this. You can see there I already missed that corner there just under the lip of the X. Very easy to do, but just as easy to spot when you haven't done it, because you will see like an anomaly. Really, it won't be as sharp as the other corners. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to, like with all things, I want to try and have a rounded edge to things so that the light can catch the edges and glint and things like that and show you highlights. There's nothing worse than seeing just a flat edge along surfaces. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm thinking that I can, as I'm drawing on the screen here, this is just to illustrate that I want to apply the colors from the ZX Spectrum branding, as it were. So here's the image that I found online when I was doing my research, and it's a web page showing you all of the colors from the ZX Spectrum logo. So they're very garish, of course, unfortunately, from the 80s being what it is. They look much better on the actual unit itself. So what I thought I'd do is split this copy, the text, along its length, and actually add separate colors to each banding of that text. So rather than just replicating the logo you see there, I'm going to take each of these colors and apply the red, the yellow, the green and the cyan, and possibly I think the black as well we did in the end as well, along each of that. So in order to do that, we need to obviously add more edge loops and splice this object up a little bit more. Obviously I've added a subdivision surface modifier there just to smooth things off. So what I'm doing now is I'm separating the front and the back of the model basically, and I've applied the mirror modifier because we have to add colors along the depth of that text, so we can't use the mirror modifier anymore. So going into rendered view, you can see we've got just obviously the default material on there, and it's just obviously the same color. So let's work on creating the first one, and we can figure out all the details later on. This is just a first draft color basically, so we can play around with the values and the types of material that we use further down the line. So let's create the red one first, and I think it would probably look nicer if it was metallic, so I did go for metallic. It gives it a much kind of more punchier look, I feel. Also kind of goes with the whole computer ZX Spectrum kind of vibe, really. The roughness, we'll come back to that, because I definitely tweaked it later on further down in the videos. I'm just trying to here with the shader, try to see what works and get a feel for what is a nice kind of overall finish. You saw that I played around with adding clear coat, but I didn't feel that was going to add any real benefit to it, so I didn't do that. So with that said, I've moved on to the yellow color now. So I duplicated the red one, add a new slot, select the red one you've previously created, and then hit the little double icon, like a file icon there, that creates a duplicate of that material. Rename it to the yellow, and then we can apply that to the text. And I'm just going here and subdividing the Z as well, because obviously these are not connected. So when I subdivided the X, it didn't subdivide didn't add the edge loops into the Z as well. So with that said, I've selected the band of polygons there by holding down the Alt key and clicking on an edge, and that will highlight, if you're in face mode of course, all of the faces in an edge loop, assign those colors to those faces. And now we can move on to the next color, which is the green. So again, I'll just speed this part up because it's the same process over and over again, really. A lot of repetition when it comes to these things. So having done that, and again, I'm just playing around with looking at this in terms of, does it work well? Is there anything that is jarring about this? And this is the very beginning, and I'm not really sure if this is going to be final at this point, obviously. So as you can see, I'm playing around with the colors again. I've decided to up the roughness to 0.35 rather than 0.25. I just felt that I didn't want it to be too shiny, and so yeah, 0.35 seems to work quite well. And what I've done here is selected those edges that divide each of those colors, and I wanted to add, rather than just a clean flat cut, I wanted to add a bit of a notch, a bit of a recess to those divisions of colors. So what I've done there is selected the edges as loops, of course. Again, be in edge mode and hold down the Alt key and click an edge, and that will highlight the edge loops for you. And with that selected, I press Ctrl B to bevel and just split them a little bit wider than what they were. At this point, I thought I would try the inflate aspect. So I wasn't quite happy. Obviously, I didn't extrude them or anything like that, so that didn't work. So by pressing Alt E, you can actually extrude faces along their normals, which is what I've done here. And that gives me a very nice extrusion going inwards, and it's not going to give me any artifacts, basically, because we're extruding along the normals of the faces. And having done that, we went back thinking again about you can see there some of the shading doesn't quite look right anymore. So, with having done that extrusion, we now need to add more supporting loops along those cuts, just to tighten up the shading and also the highlights around those edges there. So take your time to tidy it up, try and be consistent in terms of the spacing of the loop cuts that you're adding, so that you get a consistent kind of cut across each one. Yeah, I mean, you can go overboard with this stuff, right? And it's not ultimately, it wasn't absolutely necessary. You've also got to factor in things like, what resolution am I going to render at, and will this detail be noticeable? And you can see there, even on my screen there, you can still see the highlights, the light catching the edges of those cuts along the length there, or the depth. So I think that worked really well, and it adds another level of depth to the model. At this point, I'm thinking about the front of the text, and this is really where I did spend an awful lot of time trying to figure out what's the best way to do this, and what do I actually want to achieve here. And I started out with a concept in my mind, and obviously red was the initial color I had there, but I felt it was too bright and a bit too garish. Yeah, that could work, of course. But I chose not to leave it like that. I thought, well, let's introduce some of that ZX Spectrum black, or very dark grey. In fact, it was black from the colour palette that I found. And so what I've done there is I selected all the front faces, bar the very edge faces of the corners, and applied that a dark material, which is a copy of a previous colour, and just changed to black. And then applied that to the front facing ones. And you can see here that it takes a few seconds to go in there and select all of the faces, apart from the very edge ones that meet the corners and the edges, because we don't want it to spill over the edges. We just want to be in the inner facing faces there. So, and with the subdivision smooth modifier on as well, you can see that the edge is actually much looser than what we actually show in the model, and that's the subdivision surface modifier at work. So at this point, I decided to, inset the faces there. I ran into a lot of problems at this point actually, and had to rework this probably 2 or 3 times to find the best way to do it. And unfortunately, I spent a lot of time adjusting vertices here and trying different methods. But in the end, I ended up brute forcing this into what I wanted it to be, and that involved, as you're going to see very soon, adding a lot more edge loops, supporting edge loops. And I wouldn't normally do this because you end up with a topology that's quite dense in places and not very easy to manage. But you have to bear in mind, where is this model going to be used and how is it going to be used. So with that said, I had no problem adding more edge loops as I needed them to support the corners and the tightness of those areas there. As you can see, as I'm pulling it in, it's closing the that rounded kind of blocky look, and you can see there's some anomalies there with things not lining up correctly, the curvature's not quite lined up correctly. So that just means moving a few vertices around in wireframe mode. So that's what I've done there, and I spent quite a lot of time on that. I mean, not an awful lot, probably around half an hour. But obviously I'm not going to let you sit through and watch me do that. So that's the result, and there's a lot of edge loops here that I've added, as you can see in the corners. In fact, I continued to do so as I went along. These corners were fine, but then I discovered that these corners perhaps should be a little bit nicer. So they look fine at the moment, but also wanted to extrude this edge that run along the black and the red inwards, just like I did with the color separators, and that introduced a whole set of other issues that cropped up. So here I'm going to extrude them in, and what that's going to do is change the because we have the subdivision surface modifier applied, it's going to change what happens with some of these bends and corners, and as a result I will go back in and add more supporting edge loops. I think what I've learned here from this video and this tutorial is I probably shouldn't have done this, and I mean that in the best possible way, because as I say, this isn't just like a 5-minute task. It could take you half an hour, maybe longer, if you try different things. But that's how we learn to avoid certain processes in future, or certain things to do for the greater good. And you can see here that you can probably already see some glitches running along some of the corners, and that's because of the extrusion that I made and the topology in place. So here I'm just going through and adding even more edge loops into the model to tighten up those corners and make that edge a lot more profound and robust effectively. So I'm happy at this point. I think it looks really cool, and it only dawned on me after doing this video that I could have probably just used a normal map to achieve a very similar thing, and I could have done the same for the notches running down the length of the text where I've separated the colors. I think in hindsight, thinking about, you know, if I'm rendering this at a certain distance and resolution, can I get away with a texture map, or do I have to physically model some of these details in? So if I can, I'll always choose to model the details in where possible. Of course, if it's not possible, then by all means I will use a texture map. In this case, I felt I may have gotten a little bit carried away, but you know, I had the confidence that I could do it, you know, in a decent time frame, so I went with it. Your mileage may vary, of course. This is very fiddly, and I have to say I don't normally do a lot of text work in Blender, and this happens to be the second set of videos that I'm making on this channel, and it happens to involve text again. So my apology for that, guys. I don't really like doing text because it can be quite tedious and boring, but there is a method to our madness, and there's a means to an end here, so it is what it is. We could have also not use the words ZX Spectrum, of course, because, you know, this is a scenario that isn't real. Of course, this is not a real job. This is not for a real company. It's just a made up, you know, project that somebody's given to you as a designer. So what you probably normally find is that obviously ZX Spectrum is very likely to be a trademarked name or copyright name of some kind. So you probably wouldn't be using these words anyway. You'd probably think, well, you know, what can I do then to show this is about, you know, ZX Spectrum, and you know, that's where you do your research about, you know, what is it that makes the ZX Spectrum so distinguishable, so identifiable as a Speccy. So the first thing that hit me were the colors. So instead of doing like, you know, the text here that we're doing today, we could have perhaps made a, you know, maybe I don't know, a random computer thing, object model that had these colors kind of, you know, designed into it, not in the same way as the ZX Spectrum, of course, but something to I guess respect that really, and complement it. So you could have also used those colors in maybe in some other way, like, you know, a band or some other model, maybe cylindrical or whatever you want it to be, a ribbon even, that kind of thing, and just work that into some symbols, like, you know, as you may have saw in the intro there, I used some retro style computer game symbols, like, you know, the Space Invader and things like that, to give a feeling of retro computing, which is what the era of the ZX Spectrum was all about. Looking back on it now, of course, at the time it was cutting edge, I guess. I don't know if I ever had a ZX Spectrum actually. I had a Commodore 64 for sure. I remember playing on that. I wasn't sure if we had a Spectrum. Maybe I was too young at the time, but maybe my interests were elsewhere, like comics. I was a big fan of comics back in the day, and I still am for the right creators, of course. Always still following that. So anyway, while I've been talking, the video's progressed, of course, and you can see that I've the same process as before. We've taken the Spectrum text now and extruded that, added the mirror modifier. But again, very simple stuff, nothing groundbreaking here. And I think because the Spectrum words are going to be a lot smaller than the ZX, I wasn't going to spend as much time, you know, modeling a lot of detail into it. So as I mentioned earlier, what I'm doing here is I've selected all of these edges and changed the edge data, in particular the mean bevel weight to 1. And as I said, we can use that to target edges that we want to make beveled, rather than me adding edge loops in and things like that. I decided to try this approach instead, and by doing so, I also created a vertex group there, which I may or may not have used actually at some point, but it's always just a good idea to create them just in case while you've got all these selected, because sometimes it can take you a few minutes to select all the right edges or vertices, and then you click away and then you lose them. You've got to do it all over again unless you've got the undos there to help you. So with that said, we're going to add to the bevel modifier here, turning wireframe off so you can see. And initially it wasn't quite working, and I wasn't really sure what was going on here. So switching it to weight, because that's the parameter, the limit method that we're using. Yeah, I was changing the value, but I couldn't see the edges actually being beveled. And I was, for a second there, I was thinking, okay, what's going on? Why is this not working? And all will be revealed. I'll just let this play out while we see what happens here. And obviously at this point I'm looking at the face normals because I hadn't checked those earlier, and that can affect how, you know, things work or don't work actually within Blender, of course. So by doing that, I'm now trying again the amount of bevel, and it doesn't seem to be working again. So here I'm checking through, you know, is there something that I inadvertently turned on and off? But no, it happened to be the clamp overlap, which was already on by default. And it must be something to do with the topology of these letters that it didn't quite like at the default state of the bevel modifier. So I turned clamp overlap off, and that seemed to jump the bevel modifier into life. So I made my adjustments there and got it to the size that I like and the segments that I felt were enough to give it a nice rounded edge. So here I'm selecting all the front faces, insetting them a little bit. And of course, because we adopted some of the data from the outer edges, you notice there I set the mean bevel weight to 0 on those faces or edges that I had selected. So now I'm going back to the bevel modifier and just making some minor adjustments to the size and amount. And I'm looking at the corners in particular because I want to try and avoid having triangles. Nothing wrong with triangles, but I do like to work to quads if I can. And I don't think in this case it's going to make a huge amount of difference at this, you know, there's so many corners, and the resolution we're going to work to, it's not going to make a huge difference. So I think I just left it at that, and that was fine. It didn't look bad at all. Just making sure to add shade smooth and turn the wireframe off so we can see more of the model as a whole. It's always worth sometimes as well going to the data there, the normal data, and just turning auto smooth on, and that will just help you make the object look a little bit more solid and, you know, I guess harder on some of the edges and corners. So that helps a lot. Now I'm thinking about, you know, what kind of colors should I be applying to this spectrum text. Also like to switch to madcaps quite frequently when I'm modeling, because that really helps me identify any problem areas with the topology or the model. In this instance it was fairly straightforward, so I think I was quite happy just to carry on at this point. Now making the spectrum words smaller, and at this point I'm not worried about, you know, this is going to be final. It's just purely, is this good? Can I move on to the next stage of the concept? And so I'm just going to, you know, resize some of this, put them in the middle or along the center of some of the axes, just to make sure that they're nice and tidy. Here I want to have the same depth as the ZX, so I'm making sure that I've got my snapping set to vertex, and by using the handle there, the green y-axis, I can then click on that, drag it, hold down the control key, and then as I move my mouse cursor over other vertices in the scene, it will snap the vertices along that axis to the one that I've moused over, which is a really nice way to make sure things are lined up. So I'm just looking around the model now, seeing, you know, how I feel about it. I think the black was a little bit too dark there, of course, and we don't really have any context yet as a whole scene. So for now, I changed it to red. I thought that was pretty cool. Again, I'm just going over the model now, looking for any problem areas or things that I'd missed, and exactly that. Here's something that I'd missed earlier. Remember earlier we went around and selected all of these edges and the corners and the crevices and the peaks of the model. It's very easy to miss a few here and there, so you will notice them if you just take your time to just review the model. It will save you a lot of time later on when you spot things, maybe when it's too late when you rendered something. So make sure you double check your model, pick up anything that you missed, and I missed quite a few actually that I hadn't spotted there. There was a few on the P that I missed, so I've selected those and changed the mean bevel weight to 1 so that the bevel modifier actually targets those edges as well and applies the same bevel parameters to those edges. That took me a few seconds to do that, so again I didn't want to watch you sit there watching me doing that again, so I sped that up for you. Yeah, so a final look over the model. That's looking good. I love the matte caps, they're so useful, especially the red one with the shiny look. It really helps to highlight some stuff there. I think you can guess what we're going to do now, because I just applied the mirror modifier, and sure enough we're going to add more edge loops into each letter for the purpose of adding all of the colors again down the length of each of the letters. And again, in hindsight, there's a much quicker way to do this, and that is to switch into wireframe mode. Press 3 on your numpad, and that will take you to the side view, assuming your text is orientated along the x-axis on the front axis. So in the side view you can see right through the model in wireframe, and then you can switch to the knife tool with the K key on the keyboard, and then you can literally just cut through the whole model from top to bottom, and it will just project it through the whole model. It won't do that by default, mind. So when you're in the knife tool mode, you'll notice at the bottom of the Blender window you get this like context menu with options telling you what you can and can't do, obviously with certain key presses. In the knife tool you can choose to snap to axes, snap to angles, cut through rather than just cutting what you see in the viewport. It won't cut through the whole model by default. So have a quick scan of that and press maybe a letter, like I think it was C was one of them, to cut through or something like that. And that will just literally cut through the whole model for you in one go. I chose to just add in the edge loops by hand there because I wanted them to be centered, divided by 4 effectively. So adding edge loops, made sure I did that, of course, because it's 50-50 when you add an edge loop. And with that done, I'd like to now add a empty cube and just parent these 2 objects to the cube, and that way when I get to use them later on, I don't have to manipulate the ZX and the Spectrum separately. I can just select the empty box and rotate it, scale it, and move it around as one element basically. So add the cube, just give it a roughly the same size as the elements you want to parent to. So select the 2 objects, select the cube last, and then hit Ctrl P, and that will parent the objects to the empty. So with that done, the sizing, select the 2 objects, select the box last. I pressed Alt P by mistake there. Hit Ctrl P and set parent to object. And now select the cube and you can see that it moves everything with it. I wanted to bring in some, and rename it of course. So to complete this part, I wanted to add some kind of retro gaming symbols like maybe Space Invader or Pac-Man or something like that. So whilst I was doing some research, I stumbled across this software called Blockbench, and you can find out more about it on blockbench.net. I'll show you the website in 1 second. There we go. So I downloaded that and I created some very basic block elements like a Space Invader, a Pac-Man, and some other bits and pieces. And it turns out that this was probably more work than I would have liked. I could have easily done this in Blender, but I wanted to try something new. Why not? And it didn't take long. It didn't take that long to do. But in hindsight, I wouldn't do that again. I would just model it in Blender and do it that way. So import the object files. And I'm not going to show you the whole process because it did take a while to fix a few geometry errors that I was getting from Blockbench. Not the software's fault, it's just something that didn't quite work for this use case. And so yeah, with that said, I just let the video play out, and you can see here I was importing the objects and fixing them as I went along. They're not perfect, but for this tutorial they will do, and I'm sure you can do a much better job than I did here. I probably shouldn't have tried to do this at this point, but why not? So anyway, skipping ahead, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. See you soon. Take care.